Quick question for you all today. What do Saudi Arabia, the UK, the USA, the UAE, and the Yemeni government, the Houthis, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda all have in common? Well, it's just one thing, of course. They're trying to influence the same place, and it's not big enough for the 8 of them. The nation really needs no introduction. Yemen, the basket case of the modern world. The tangled spiderweb of competing forces, all vying for power, wrapped up in the worst humanitarian crisis on the planet today. The crisis there today exacerbates some of the most wide-scale suffering in the world. This, by its very nature, poses a few questions. Has Yemen always been this way, destined to be always divided physically, ideologically, and militarily? Why has Yemen got to the point of total collapse and state failure today? How do we untangle that spiderweb to get a key understanding of the actors involved, their allegiances, and their actions? And what do the Houthis and international shipping have to do with all of it? Well, join us today for that and more as we take you on a journey to a land where the Arabian Nights are as bad as the Arabian Days. A nation that has spent the last decade fighting a brutal civil war, but one that you've likely barely ever heard about on the news. This is the story of the country of Yemen. To understand the complex history of this arid country, we need to go back to where the first modern remnants of what would become Yemen began. Grab your best black suit, because we're going to the funeral of an empire. While civilizations have lived in the land known as Yemen for 3 millennia, if we were to do a total comprehensive breakdown on Yemen's history, I would die of exhaustion, and I like living. So we're going to give you some quick context before getting into the history. All you really need to know is that Yemen has been an Islamic land for a long time, and it was under the control of both the Ottoman Empire and the British Empire in 1917. The Ottoman influence was patchy, whilst the British seized the port of Aden to use as a refueling station on the way to India. And yes, this is another video where the British Empire is partially responsible for the state of a modern nation today. Sorry about that. The fabled sick man of Europe finally succumbed to his illness in 1918 as World War I ravaged the dying empire like a cancer. As the Ottoman Empire fell away, its ashes gave rise to several new nations, one of which was North Yemen. Yes, the country that we now know as Yemen was originally 2 countries. South Yemen was still a British protectorate at this time and wouldn't gain its independence until 1967. And Simon, I hear you cry. Doesn't the territory of North and South Yemen actually exist more along the east to west divide? Wouldn't East and West Yemen make more sense? And well, yes, it would, you very well-informed political history expert. But this is Yemen, where nothing makes sense. Geographically and geopolitically, they are East and West. However, the North and South monikers actually both came during the Cold War to represent their differing ideologies as nations. North Yemen was known at the time as the Mutawakkilite Kingdom of Yemen until 1962, and it was run by a monarchy of Zaidi Imams. The Zaidi are a long-standing Shia Muslim religious minority in Yemen, and hold on to that thought because it will be important later. In 1962, a revolution deposed the royal Zaidi family, and it became the Yemen Arab Republic. A traditionally conservative regime that was an authoritarian Islamic nation, it had close ties with many of the Gulf states and was influenced by tribal politics. South Yemen, after gaining independence from Britain in 1967, became a Marxist-Leninist state, adopting a communist ideology with support from the Soviet Union and other Eastern Bloc nations. It was the only Marxist state in the Arab world governed by the National Front for the Liberation of South Yemen, later called the Yemeni Socialist Party. This socialist system involved state control of the economy, land reforms, and efforts to secularize and modernize society. As you can imagine, these 2 states existing during the Cold War is a good example of just how much the Cold War shaped modern-day geopolitics. These 2 nations, at one of the most polarizing times in global history, could not be more ideologically distinct from one another. One hyper-traditional, conservative Islamic authoritarian regime and a secular Marxist-Leninist republic. Having 2 nations with a common ancestry this ideologically divided could not lead anywhere good, and indeed, it didn't lead anywhere good. During the Cold War, North Yemen saw its longest-standing dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh, come to power in 1978 following the assassination of President Ahmad al-Ghashmi by bomb. Saleh had climbed high into the military and security ladder in North Yemen and took hold of the country at just 36 years old. He would prove a crafty dictator and hold on to power for decades through filling the military with soldiers loyal to him. In 1990, the Soviet Union began to break apart, ending the Cold War and also ending support for the South Yemen regime. Both Yemeni nations would seek unification in 1990. Saleh sought to stabilize the country and solidify its legacy. Both nations had a shared history and culture in the region, and attempts had been made over the decades to unify both countries, but for one reason or another, just never came to be. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, with the need for a stable Yemen as international shipping grew, and with the possibility of the nation prospering more when unified, unification looked to all parties like a no-brainer, or at least that was the plan. In reality, despite their shared heritage and cultural ties, the nations were significantly different and had spent the latter half of the 20th century on completely different ends of the political spectrum. That division had defined them for so long that now they were one nation again. Could they reconcile their differences? The very principles both nations were founded on were diametrically opposed, and tensions were absolutely bound to rise, and they did. Until 1994, when the first Yemeni civil war broke out. The North dominated the political and military institutions of the nation, making the South feel like an afterthought. In 1993, the vice president and former president of South Yemen, Ali Salim al-Baid, resigned from the government and retreated to the southern capital of Aden. Northern forces quickly advanced and won the ensuing struggle by capturing Aden, ending the secessionist movement. Yemen would remain united for now, but it was a rocky start to life as the two nations became one. The North continued to dominate the South, whilst resolving none of the South's grievances, paving the way for future conflict. Saleh continued to rule throughout the 90s and noughties, with increasing authoritarianism, corruption, and economic difficulties, all while still ignoring the South. Tensions were rising again, but the group who would light the spark, well, nobody expected them. So let's introduce the Houthis. Now, the Houthis are a Shia rebel group, also known as Ansar Allah, and most importantly of all, they were Zaydis. Do you remember those guys, the ones who ruled North Yemen back when it was the Mutawakkalite Kingdom of Yemen? What began as a cultural and religious revivalist movement for the Zaydis in the 90s grew into a full-on guerrilla insurgency by 2004. The Houthis wanted more autonomy for the area of Yemen they originate from, known as Sadr. It made sense then to call this conflict the Sadr Wars. The Shia Zaydi Houthis, led by the founder of the movement, Hussein Badr Eddin al-Houthi, felt marginalized by the central government. Under al-Houthi, the Zaydis increasingly took up more anti-government stances, eventually leading to the total denouncement of the government by the Houthis. What's more is that they had genuine grassroots supports from local tribal communities, as well as those who had been marginalized in the north by the central government, like the Houthis were. The insurgency, however, was just a fledgling one in 2004 when fighting broke out between the Houthis and the Saleh regime. It had some minor support from Iran, but largely it had to focus on guerrilla and asymmetric warfare in order to survive. In the same year that the conflict broke out, Hussein Badr Eddin al-Houthi was killed by government forces in the fighting. However, rather than this collapsing the insurgency into infighting, the group rallied around its martyred leader. The late founder's brother, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, took over the movement, and he's actually still in charge today. During the Sadr Wars, the Houthis became battle-hardened and experienced in guerrilla warfare. Their military infrastructure in the north grew, as did its support from Tehran. The Houthis would begin to expand their territory in Yemen, which was anything but good for the rest of the population. The Sadr Wars would continue until 2010, when peace negotiations were brokered by Qatar. This came just in time for Saleh, as the winds of change were blowing through the Arab world like a sandstorm. The Arab Spring was a series of anti-government protests that started in December of 2010 in Tunisia before spreading throughout the Arab world. This eventually reached Yemen too in 2011, where widespread demonstrations protested Saleh's continued authoritarian rule. Pressure was mounting from all sides for Saleh to step down. Internationally, the Gulf Cooperation Council put pressure on him to resign. Meanwhile, tensions in the country were rising in opposition to him. He even narrowly survived an assassination attempt in June of 2011 when a bomb exploded in a mosque, seriously injuring him and further weakening his position symbolically as leader. Eventually, in February of 2012, and after 33 years of rule, Ali Abdullah Saleh would step down, handing power over to his second-in-command, Abdrabbuh Mansour Hadi, with a Saudi-backed plan for transition. This was the moment when Yemen could have cast off the shackles of authoritarian rule. The country was united and it was at peace. The people had just peacefully ended a 3-decade-long military dictatorship, and from here, Yemen would surely prosper in a future founded by and for the people. Right? Well, no, not exactly. This power exchange appeared more cosmetic than anything else. Haiti's government was unable to implement the reforms that were promised by the transition government, only further fueling tension in the country. What's worse was that Yemen was going through an economic crisis in 2013. The Saleh regime had left high unemployment, high levels of corruption, fuel shortages, and crumbling infrastructure. The state security apparatus was starting to break down as Saleh had taken his loyalist forces with him when he resigned. As such, groups like the Houthis, ISIS, and Al-Qaeda were able to establish themselves within Yemen. Haiti attempted to purge the government forces of Saleh loyalists, but it backfired into mutiny. And then, everything exploded. In 2014, the Houthis and former President Saleh formed an alliance, massively strengthening the Houthis with Saleh's loyalist forces. Their joint forces were greater than that of the Yemeni government, and knowing that fact, they sprang into action. The Houthis used their experience of fighting the Saleh regime to now fight alongside him and quickly surrounded the capital city of Sana'a. They arrested President Hadi and forced him to resign before he later escaped to Aden, renouncing his resignation. This led to a political crisis where the Houthis declared themselves the rulers of all of Yemen, whilst Hadi's government also claimed legitimacy, creating a power vacuum in the nation. By 2015, President Hadi had fled to Saudi Arabia as full-blown civil war broke out in the nation for the second time in 3 decades. Hadi's government had international support, but domestically had no power because Saleh's forces and the Houthis were so strong. Hadi appealed to the international community for help. In 2015, a coalition of Arab states led by Saudi Arabia and the UAE, but also including Bahrain, Jordan, Egypt, Kuwait, Morocco, Sudan, and Qatar, began military operations in Yemen to put the Hadi government back in charge. But that was no easy task. Saleh and the Houthis had an awful lot of forces. The Houthis, especially, were difficult to dislodge from the nation's mountainous terrain. Meanwhile, Al-Qaeda's influence continued to grow throughout the country. At the same time, in 2015, the Yemeni government announced a total blockade of all commercial and humanitarian shipping, only allowing items into the country after intense inspections. As the Haiti government had no naval force, this role fell to the coalition. The coalition and the Yemeni government were concerned about Iran sending supplies disguised as aid to the Houthis. Many attempts have been made to end the blockade, as it's a significant reason that the humanitarian crisis in the nation is so bad today. However, it appears for the coalition that this is too big of a risk to take. However, if there's one thing we do know about Yemen, it's that nothing ever makes sense. The political allegiances of various factions across the nation often switch and swap. Allies on Monday are enemies by Friday. A great example would be everyone's favorite Yemeni dictator who just couldn't let go, Saleh. In 2017, it was revealed that Saleh was talking to the Saudis under the table to get security guarantees in return for the defection of his forces to the coalition, which would crush the Houthis in short order. The alliance between the Houthis and Saleh officially ended, and after a long life of scheming, playing the political game, and being a dictator, Ali Abdullah Saleh was assassinated by Houthi forces as he tried to leave Sana'a. In a moment of poetic justice, the very thing he helped create, fought against, and then fought alongside would be his downfall. The Houthis were quick to try and consolidate as much territory, manpower, and equipment as they could from Saleh's forces. Some joined, but many defected to the coalition following the death of their leader. By this time, though, the Houthis were a wholly independent fighting force, a state within a state, with established de facto control over much of North Yemen, including, crucially, the capital. They held key logistical supply lines in the north, as well as military bases and weapons depots. As their insurgency became more and more advanced, they were able to get hold of drone and missile technology, mostly from Iran. This allowed the Houthis to fire over the border at Saudi oil facilities. These are also the technologies that have allowed the Houthis to start pestering international shipping in Gulf of Aden and the Red Sea since 2023. Specifically, the Bab al-Mandab Strait, a choke point between the Horn of Africa and Houthi-controlled Yemen, presents the perfect place to attack cargo ships from. It leads up to the Suez Canal and is vital for oil and gas exports. The US Department of Energy estimates that 12% of all seaborne trade travels through the strait. So, you can see why nations were coming down hard on the Houthis as they grew bolder in attacking shipping on a major sea lane. In April of 2022, there was a 6-month ceasefire in Yemen that briefly gave hope for peace. It was originally supposed to last for 2 months and was extended numerous times. This allowed some negotiations to happen between the Houthis and the coalition and allowed some more humanitarian aid to enter the region. However, violations of the ceasefire and an inability to find find common ground led to the collapse of negotiations back into fighting. At first, it was just as intense before slowing down into a less intense conflict that allowed for more negotiation. However, this fragile, semi-truce, semi-war, low-intensity conflict is still exacerbating the humanitarian crisis going on in Yemen. Death is still commonplace. The almost total aid blockade around the nation still stands, and as a result, the destruction and suffering for the civilians is only getting worse. Alright, so now you've got the context, we can start to understand the political situation in Yemen today and how it's affecting life for the Yemeni people. Whilst we've gone through most of the actors fighting on the ground in Yemen that were relevant to the major points of Yemeni history, we haven't actually mentioned them all, as some are minor factions with less significance but are on the ground with their own forces nonetheless, and so should merit mentioning. So, who are the actors fighting over Yemen today? Well, several we've already told you about. The internationally recognized Yemeni government made up of President Hadi and 7 members of his cabinet in a presidential leadership council. They're one. They are backed by a coalition of the UAE and Saudi Arabia, among other Gulf nations. Riyadh and Abu Dhabi intervened in Yemen for several reasons. The Houthis represented a threat to international security, especially when aligned with regional rival Shia Iran. KSA and the UAE want to maintain regional security, preserve order, and keep trade routes running in this crucial area for maritime shipping. Both of these nations would also prefer to prevent a failed state on the Saudi border and the ensuing refugee crisis that could arise. The Saudi-led coalition side is also backed by much of the Western world through arms sales to Saudi Arabia and the UAE. However, an internal report from the US Government Accountability Office, or GAO, found serious gaps in US government oversight of how arms sold to Saudi Arabia and the UAE were being used. In September of 2023, the Washington Post found that the US Army's Security Assistance Command had been training Saudi border guards for the past 8 years. Those same border guards allegedly shot and killed at least hundreds of Ethiopian migrants and asylum seekers trying to cross the Saudi-Yemen border from 2022 to 2023. That's according to Human Rights Watch. This would constitute a crime, and shows that even Western nations are not without blame for the state that Yemen is in today. Some have accused the US of selling weapons to Saudi Arabia that then fall into the hands of both Al-Qaeda and the Houthis, but even still, then US President Donald Trump vetoed several bills that would halt arms sales to Saudi Arabia. On the other side, you have the Houthis, backed partially by Iran and Hezbollah. The Houthis hold much of the north of the country and have a brutal authoritarian Islamist regime led by Abdul Malik al-Houthi, son of the deceased founder of the movement. They oppose foreign intervention in the country, as well as Sunni Islam, and so are against the coalition, whilst also being against the Yemeni government anyway after establishing control over the nation's capital. According to the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, although Iran sees cooperation with non-state actors as an integral part of its foreign policy to protect and expand its influence, its support for the Houthis has been helpful but marginal. The military support Iran has provided to the Houthis since at least 2011 has been largely limited to training and media support, mostly channeled through Lebanese Hezbollah, as well as some weapons exports. That is to say that Tehran are likely not coming to the Houthis' aid if they were in need. In fact, there is reason to believe that whilst religiously and ideologically aligned on some issues, Iran and the Houthis are distinct actors with distinctly different goals. The Huffington Post reported that according to American intelligence officials familiar with the Houthis' takeover, Iranian representatives actually discouraged the group from taking the Yemeni capital of Sana'a in 2014. The Houthis are very much a force unto themselves, with significant resources to impose their will on parts of Yemen. They are able to hold ground and fight to protect what they see as their own territory against an internationally backed coalition with far superiority. These guys are not just one of Tehran's puppets. They are no joke. And those are the two major players in the country, but that's not all. There are also several smaller groups aiming to take advantage of the chaos in the nation, such as the Islah Party, a political party with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood and with militias who have fought both parties we just mentioned, but they're largely an anti-Houthi force. There is the Southern Transitional Council, or STC, a separatist group in southern Yemen that seeks the partition of the nation back to how it was pre-unification. It's primarily supported by the UAE, although it has fought the Hadi government at times, despite both being under the coalition's banner. The STC also fight the Houthis and made an agreement with the Hadi government in 2020 to a mutual power-sharing agreement in post-war Yemen. There is also Al-Qaeda, who are always quick to take advantage of an Islamic nation's vulnerability, gaining a foothold in the south and east of the nation, although it has a minor presence throughout the entire country. Al-Qaeda spent most of their time in Yemen being bombed by the USA. The almost 400 airstrikes the US has conducted in Yemen through the Obama and Trump administrations has led to some high-profile Al-Qaeda operatives going to paradise. However, this has also resulted in the deaths of over 100 civilians, according to the Council on Foreign Relations. On top of that, you have ISIS, who, like Al-Qaeda, are trying to establish their own caliphate, and like Al-Qaeda, actively attack both the coalition forces and the Houthis, but do not have as much of an impact as the Houthis or Al-Qaeda do. The Islamic State marked its 2015 entrance into Yemen with suicide attacks on 2 Zaidi mosques in Sana'a, which killed close to 140 worshippers. The group has claimed that it's committed other major attacks, including the assassination of Aden's governor in 2015. And just for a sense of scale here, ISIS are thought to have hundreds of supporters in Yemen, whilst Al-Qaeda are thought to have over 7,000. After that, you have the sponsoring nations involved in international NGOs trying to help the people struggling in the country. The Houthis have largely been able to see both terror organizations off as of mid-2024, but you can never count out organizations as crafty and deeply rooted in criminality as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Their influence over areas of Yemen still exists, as do their supporters. Today, the Houthis still hold large parts of North Yemen and are seemingly even still growing in support scope and size despite the coalition's continuous aerial bombardment. The Sadr Wars trained much of the Houthi forces in fighting an insurgency against a much larger power. Now that their capabilities were even greater, they were able to do the exact same thing on a much larger scale. Their access to the sea in the north makes them a nuisance for global trade, and you might naturally ask, well, why are the Houthis attacking international shipping? Well, there are several reasons. It's a show of their military capability. It puts the spotlight on the group that, whilst coming with international backlash, may also garner support from Shia Muslim extremist groups. It's also an act of protest against the ongoing blockade of the nation. This may even garner the Houthi sympathy from those in the country also affected by the blockade, which is almost everybody. Finally, it's about strategic leverage and pressure. If the Houthis are able to attack international shipping affecting the exports of nations, especially arms exports to Saudi Arabia or energy exports from the Gulf, further pressure will be put on the coalition to end the blockade, which will be seen as not working. This is a clear advantage the Houthis are trying to press, as they appear to be able to gather resources regardless of the blockade. So, in doing something like attacking shipping, they both gather international support by protesting the blockade while simultaneously showing its ineffectiveness. Ideally, though, the Houthis would prefer to not have to always smuggle their goods and weapons into the nation. If the blockade ended, that process becomes far less risky for them. The tactic appears to be working, as on the 30th of August 2024, the Houthis released a video showing a burning oil tanker which was carrying 1 million barrels of oil when it was captured. If the Houthis are able to get even more consistent access to energy exports like oil and gas, their wealth will grow exponentially and their capability to fight will do too. Though it is important to note that ship in particular was highlighted as a danger for an oil spill, so it is unknown how much oil, if any, the Houthis were able to plunder. As an insurgency, despite total air superiority from the coalition, they have proven extremely difficult to beat back by coalition forces on the ground. The ground forces in Yemen who fight for the coalition are largely Yemeni forces, newly trained by the coalition, alongside the small group of government loyalist soldiers and those who defected following Saleh's death in 2017. These forces get modern equipment and military training from the coalition, but they're up against entrenched, battle-hardened militants in the Houthis with a lot of firepower and local support. They don't have the experience or as much knowledge of the local areas as the Houthis do. Throw in that they're extremely hard to dislodge, especially from mountainous regions in Houthi territory, as well as fragmented unity among coalition forces, and it's no wonder that the coalition has struggled as much as it has to loosen the Houthis' grip over North Yemen. However, coalition forces are trying to meet the challenge head-on and overcome these disadvantages. Every year they spend fighting the Houthis is greater experience for the ground forces. With superior technology and firepower, logic dictates that the balance will swing in the coalition's favor eventually, although that does appear to be quite a way off at the moment. The Houthis, in around 30 years, have been able to create an insurgency that went from minor nuisance to major international disruptor. They have never been as strong as they are right now. The Houthis continue to fire drones and missiles into coalition nations, but principally Saudi Arabia. Several rounds of talks and attempts by the UN to mediate peace discussions have faced significant challenges. For one, if the Houthis are allowed to legitimately establish themselves further in Yemen, there will be fears from Saudi Arabia of a partially Iran-backed power on its southern border. For war to happen, you need two things: a bargaining friction and a substantive disagreement. The Saudi-led coalition government and the Yemeni government have a substantive disagreement with the Houthis over the sovereignty of the territory. The Houthis de facto administer the land they're in and believe it's rightfully theirs, going all the way back to the Zaidi imams who ruled the area decades beforehand. Meanwhile, the coalition forces put forward the Hadi transitionary cabinet as the legitimate, internationally recognized government. The bargaining friction comes from neither side budging on those beliefs, and so we have a blockade, a war, and a humanitarian crisis. In January 2024, the UK and the USA started bombing the Houthis themselves owing to the threat to international shipping that they were posing. However, outside of a show of force and killing a few Houthis, airstrikes are not going to eliminate the insurgency alone. Furthermore, a peaceful settlement with the Houthis does not mean that fighting in the nation would end. There are other forces seeking to establish themselves in Yemen, as we've mentioned. If there is peace with the Houthis, who deals with Al-Qaeda? The war doesn't end when the two main warring factions stop, when you have other non-state actors ready to fight and hold their ground. As a result, you end up with what we have in Yemen today: a tangled, messy web of alliances, a military force that hasn't been able to dislodge the insurgents, an anemic and weak government propped up by international forces, and a humanitarian crisis so severe that the EU labeled it the worst of its kind in the world. As you can imagine, having this many actors, all with their own visions for Yemen and most fighting against each other, has created a black hole of tragedy, death, destruction, and human rights violations, all of which falls hardest on Yemen's most vulnerable. Yemen's crises as a nation have been going on for more than a decade. The EU deemed it the worst humanitarian crisis currently on the planet. Only a short look at some of these numbers reveals the staggering scale of the suffering going on there. A good case study for this is food and water. Even just the basic concept of these basic necessities unearths the perfect storm of violence and suffering that the Yemeni people are facing. UNICEF reports that 2.2 million children in Yemen are suffering from acute malnutrition, including over 500,000 suffering from severe acute malnutrition, a condition that, if untreated, could be fatal. In short, they're starving to death. Now, bear in mind that we're often looking at confirmed numbers only, meaning the actual numbers for lots of stuff like this is likely to be even higher. The International Rescue Committee reports that food prices have skyrocketed since the conflict began, more than doubling since 2015. The war has decimated the local economy, causing the Yemeni rial to plummet in value. Now, 80% of Yemeni people live below the poverty line, according to Oxfam. In a nation that imported a large proportion of its food to begin with, that is a dangerous mix. Not that much can get into the country anyway, mind you, as the ongoing blockade keeps out a lot of food and humanitarian aid. Floods and droughts in Yemen in the past several years have only made things worse. You'd think that with so little food to go around and very little coming into the country, that those within the country would try to preserve food and water infrastructure, but you'd be wrong. Watana, a Yemeni human rights organization on the ground in the nation, has reported that the warring factions in Yemen have actively targeted food and water infrastructure, including farms, irrigation works, and fishing boats. This is a violation of international law that has exacerbated the food crisis in Yemen. The UN reports that a staggering 14 million people, half the nation's population, face a clear and present danger of imminent famine. It is the world's largest food security emergency. Children fare some of the worst in Yemen, not just as a result of food insecurity, but also just its sheer level of danger. The UN verified more than 11,000 children have been killed or seriously injured in the conflict between 2015 and 2022. Meanwhile, UNICEF reports that over 4,000 children have been recruited as child soldiers by the warring parties. Men are most likely to die in the fighting, whilst women bear the brunt of the brutal Islamic regime in parts of the nation, as well as the food insecurity. In Houthi-controlled areas, women are forbidden from traveling in public without a male relative. What we're getting at is that nobody's doing well here. Infrastructure isn't safe, as we mentioned in the food example, but it doesn't stop there. The Yemeni archive reports 900 cases of attacks on and military use of education and health facilities. Attacks on medical facilities are common, including airstrikes that lead to civilian casualties. Saudi-led coalition forces are allegedly responsible for 72 attacks. Houthi forces are allegedly responsible for 52, with the rest making up a handful between them. Al-Thara Hospital in the capital of Sana'a has been attacked 9 times. The Yemeni archive has also tracked substantial attacks on bridges and schools, which stops children's education and the transport of any humanitarian aid that does manage to get in. Worse still, many people are unable to access that aid. The Norwegian Refugee Council reported that 14% of Yemen's population, that's around 4.5 million people, have been displaced by the conflict. Many have been displaced more than once. Humanitarian organizations simply don't have the money to cope with the scale of the crisis as it spirals out of control. It isn't just bombs falling from the sky to worry about either, as Yemen has a severe landmine problem. According to Human Rights Watch, landmines and explosive remnants killed 121 civilians in the first quarter of 2023 alone. The Houthis tend to utilize landmines heavily, including the use of mines in areas containing objects critical for survival, including farmland, water sources, and water infrastructure. This too is a war crime and only makes the issue of food security in the country worse. Human Rights Watch tells us that all parties of the conflict, including the Houthi forces, the Yemeni government, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and various UAE and Saudi-backed Yemeni armed groups, have arbitrarily arrested, forcibly disappeared, tortured, and ill-treated detainees across Yemen. Hundreds of Yemenis have been detained at official and unofficial detention centers across the country. There was a substantial prisoner swap in April 2024 between the coalition and the Houthis, but many more are still being held. What's more is that you have a situation in Yemen where unnecessary restrictions are placed on humanitarian organizations, causing delays to the average Yemeni citizen receiving humanitarian aid. Both the Yemeni government and the Houthis have done this, imposing bureaucratic requirements that reduce people's abilities to access aid or diverting aid away from enemy forces and towards their own. The Houthis currently hold the city of Taiz, due south of Sana'a. Human Rights Watch reports that all major roads have been closed off to the city since 2015. Aid can simply not reach the people living there, leading to an even greater crisis. Whether it's owed to food, fighting, or both, the level of suffering for average Yemeni citizens is absolutely astonishing. And what's worse is that the crisis of the nation appears to be getting worse as the Houthis grow in power and legitimacy. There is so much going on, and so few resources for those trying to help, that certain things are just starting to be lost entirely. Due to overlapping crises, the lack of resources, and the chaos of war throughout the nation, not everything is being successfully recorded, leading to a crisis of information within Yemen itself. There's something to be said about the legacy of media in Yemen's collapse. From the fact that the conflict has seen very little international coverage in comparison to a place like Syria or Ukraine, to the Houthis using the media as a key tool in their goals. However, it is the crisis of information in the country itself that is defining this conflict. The Washington Post reports that Yemen is a black hole for information in parts of the nation, and there are often attacks and killings that go unreported. 10,000 people was believed to be the commonly recognized number for the civilian death count in Yemen, but this is actually a number going back to a 2016 UN report. The true number of civilian dead is unknown, as the Yemeni government stopped reporting statistics a number of years ago. The number directly killed by airstrikes and attacks relating to the fighting appears to float between 15 and 25,000. However, in 2020, the UN reported that those killed indirectly by the war through famine, disease, and other factors hit 233,000 people. Today, estimates go as high as 377,000. There is no way to truly know the full scale of the violence in Yemen, and that's a tragedy in and of itself. Many innocent people have been killed, and nobody will be held accountable because all sides in the conflict are exacerbating the crisis for the civilians. Owing to the tactics of the nations and groups involved, journalists are not safe in Yemen either. Journalists, they are systematically targeted by all sides of this conflict, contributing to the lack of information in parts of the nation on atrocities happening there. It is not difficult to see why. The coalition, but specifically Saudi Arabia, has a bit of a poor record with journalists, with Riyadh having murdered Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi in 2018. This actually has had an effect on the conflict in Yemen, as afterwards Western powers went out of their way to limit some weapons sales and the refueling of coalition aircraft. As you can imagine, Al-Qaeda aren't keen on journalists, and neither are the Houthis, ever eager to promote their own media over independent journalists to fit the narrative of the de facto rule in North Yemen. The Yemeni archive has documented at least 182 armed conflict incidents towards media and journalistic infrastructure since 2014. A radio station worker in Yemen told the organization, "We expect danger at any moment. We work under abnormal conditions. I leave my home and don't expect to come back because of the work I do in the media, yet our duty is to continue." Yemen has never had a particularly good relationship with freedom of the press, although everything that has happened in Yemen since Saleh's regime ended has made the information space in Yemen worse and worse. If this course is not corrected, the memory of those who were lost could be lost forever, potentially dooming Yemen to repeat its mistakes in the future because nobody was held accountable for these crimes. Yemen isn't a state that's failing, it has already failed. The streets of the capital are occupied by Houthi forces. The government is in exile in a different part of the nation. Militancy runs rampant. Humanitarian organizations are stretched too thin, and there's not enough food to go around. This is no longer a state on the brink of collapse. This is the total descent of a nation into anarchy. The scale of the problem is growing too fast to be able to be handled without there being peace. And with the Houthis, the Yemeni government, and all the other factions in Yemen at each other's throats, bombing who they can and taking what they want, it is unlikely that such a needed peace will break out anytime soon. What will happen in Yemen next is not clear. But what is clear is that something needs to change for the nation, and soon. One day, however, the last bomb will be dropped, the last bullet fired, and the last explosion heard. The winds of peace will come to Yemen sooner or later. At that moment, it is up to the country to pick itself up, rebuild itself brick by brick, and start again, to strive for better for its citizens, and to find a lasting peace where Yemen can prosper. It can be done, but only if a nation is willing to learn from its missteps, to not double down on what was before, but to build something entirely new, something better. And with any luck, the Yemeni people will be able to rebuild their nation to ensure that this level of catastrophe can never happen again.